On your own from the age of 15. Reckless, aggressive, and undisciplined.
This is a rebellion, isn't it? I rebel.
We have a mission for you. A major weapons test is imminent. We need to know what it is and how to destroy it.
Is that clear?
Yes, sir.
My Nerd Road.
And welcome to it. This is episode number, well, I think we're going to have to call it 53.1 because I didn't do an episode 51. I don't know how I screwed that. Actually, I take that back. I do know how I screwed that up. Whenever I go to start the podcast, I have a hard time keeping track of the numbers the episode numbers. It's not something that I'm used to doing. 19 years of radio, I don't really keep track of how many shows that I do. So usually I write it down, and for some reason, after I did episode 50, I immediately jumped to episode 52, and I completely missed episode number 51. I mean, I suppose I could go and label this episode 51. It would almost be like a prequel, right? So, no, for the sake of argument, we'll go ahead and just label this episode. We'll make it episode 53.1. So, I'm your host, Jon Justice. Glad you're with the podcast this week. Speaking of prequels, quick observation that I'll make here at the start of the podcast. Then we have a ton of Rogue One news to get to. We love our Star Wars. We are protective of our Star Wars. We are overprotective of our Star Wars, to say the least. There were some rumors that began to trickle out about a week ago. It would have been like shortly after last week's podcast, as it relates to Rogue One and reshoots being done. And then suddenly, this thing just snowballed into some sites even reporting that some 40% of the movie was going to be reshot, that there was a lack of satisfaction through some private screenings that were done, that executives were upset and everybody was freaking out, and that all these different writers and directors were being brought in to go and reshoot all of this footage. And then there was this talk that they were going to take away the grittiness of the film and how it won't be a war movie anymore, and they were going to make it more kid-friendly. I mean, this just went on, and I mean, it's just every article, it got ramped up even more than the previous article, to the point where you would have thought this movie was, another Fantastic Four, which for those that weren't following was a massive, massive failure.
The dark side.
Thankfully, some people have come out and clarified what is exactly going on with Rogue One, and I will tell you why you don't need to worry about it. But we'll also talk a little bit about why do we care so much, and that might be a given. That might be a given why we care so much. But there's an aspect of this that I don't think a lot of people realize. It's not a dig or anything. It's just an observation, and it's actually something that I've been following and talking about quite a bit on my weekly radio show, and that is just how easy it is for individuals to go and express their pleasure or their displeasure with something, and how, as a society, we just do not do a very good job of filtering through what's important, what's not, what's a knee-jerk reaction, what's not a knee-jerk reaction. We're kind of horrible at it. So we'll talk about this as it relates to the Star Wars movies, and more specifically, Rogue One. I'm actually staring at a bunch of Rogue One Lego toys right now that I want to talk about. Before we do that, though, just briefly, I've been watching the prequels, but more specifically, I've been listening to the commentary. I don't know how many times I have listened to the commentary, the secondary commentary. I've listened to all the commentaries on the original trilogy, and all 6 movies, and unfortunately we don't have one for The Force Awakens yet, but all 6 Star Wars movies have commentaries attached to them. Some of them have multiple commentaries attached to them. And usually the first commentary is the sort of the chief movie makers, your George Lucas, your producers, your sound editors, and the like. And then you get cast archives in the original trilogies. You get a combination of both George Lucas and the producers and the cast talking about different stuff. And you have these for all 6 of the movies. And I realized that if I had, I maybe only did once, but I usually like to focus on the creation side. That's not to say that the actors aren't talking about the creation of the movie, but I like to listen to George Lucas and the effects builders and the CGI guys and the sound editors. I love hearing how it's crafted and created. I'm less interested in hearing the actor's point of view as it relates to the Star Wars movie. I still find it interesting. I just don't. That's not my go-to. And I realized that if I hadn't, I didn't remember, and if I had, it had been a long time, that I hadn't really listened to the secondary commentaries on the prequel movies, and so I decided to go and start doing that. And it's almost as if, not that it matters, but it's almost as if I wish that those that don't like the prequels would go and listen to those commentaries. I was listening to the Attack of the Clones secondary commentary, and George Lucas is included, as I mentioned, in those secondary commentaries, and it was really fascinating to hear George talk about these scenes and why he did what he did in so many of these scenes, and what he was trying to do and what he was attempting to do. And you can tell what worked and what didn't work. You could tell about the then still limited technology, if you will, as it relates to CGI. If they had made the prequel movies today, based off of how far we've come with CGI, they would. I think that they would be arguably received in a better light. Despite the wooden performances, George is a great storyteller, and I think a part of the reason, a very small part, but a part of the reason why people didn't like the prequels was because George really pushed the boundaries of the CGI work. And I've been very vocal in my criticism of some of the CGI work, especially in Revenge of the Sith. There were some scenes on Coruscant when Anakin arrives during the standoff between Mace Windu and Palpatine, and it just the CGI work is just bad. It's just bad. But it is interesting, and it provides a unique perspective, understanding, and to me, appreciation of those films when you actually hear what Lucas is trying to do. For example, when Obi-Wan Kenobi first arrives on Kamino, it's very washed out. It's very clean. All the scenes are very bright, and the colors kind of, again, the brightness is so bright that it washes out a lot of the background. And you listen to George on the commentary, and he talks specifically about that. He talks about how that was his intention. He wanted it to be very modern looking. He wanted it to be very bright, wanted it to wash out, and this was something that creatively he was trying to do. Again, it doesn't mean that it worked, but it is certainly interesting, and it does make me appreciate what George was trying to accomplish. And I also thought that maybe George didn't get his due credit by me in my glowing over The Force Awakens, and even before the film came out, talking about how George was never a fan. It looked like it seemed as if the people working on The Force Awakens cared more about Star Wars than perhaps George Lucas did. And you go back and listen to these commentaries, and I think I may be wrong on that. I think they did care. I do believe that there is a certain amount of perspective, and a much better perspective that the filmmakers had in making The Force Awakens. And certainly what it looks like they're doing with Rogue One, there's a lot of attention and care to make sure they get it right. But I think it's very unfair to think that the creators of the prequel trilogy in Lucasfilm didn't also care. These guys did care. They were fans. It worked on a much different level. And I've seen many people argue online. There's Jeremy Conrad, who used to be on the MakingStarWars.net podcast, and I've mentioned him before on my podcast. Jeremy is one of those Twitter pages where, I'll check it out daily just because he's usually on top of Star Wars breaking news, and so I can usually go there and see. And his takes and opinions on stuff are are always interesting. At Manabyte, B-Y-T-E, I believe, M-A-N-A-B-Y-T-E, on Twitter is where you can is where you can find him. And I don't know, why did I bring up Jeremy Conrad? Totally lost my train of thought talking about. Jeremy Conrad put together an editorial on his website. That's what I was going to say. With Furious Fanboys, talking about he actually feels the prequel trilogy was better than The Force Awakens in terms of what they were trying to do. And certainly George Lucas was pushing the envelope, and I've mentioned this several times. I believe that Episode 8 is going to be more akin to the prequels than it will be to the original trilogy as Episode 7 was. And the more I think about it and the more I listen to other podcasts, there was another podcast this week focusing on how over time they realized just how even more similar The Force Awakens was to the original trilogy and how they're kind of annoyed by that. I'm not. I think that the studio was very smart, and JJ and Lawrence Kasdan and all those guys were incredibly smart to go backwards to go forward, to reestablish the franchise to fans who may have been turned off by the prequel trilogy. As an example, I was watching Jurassic World last night and talking to Melinda, my wife, about how Colin Trevorrow was going to be directing the next episode 9 of the Star Wars sequel trilogy. And then I realized, watching Jurassic World, just how much of Jurassic World mirrored the original Jurassic Park and its success as well. And I believe that in the next Jurassic World movie, whatever they call it, they'll be taking a lot of risks having reestablished that franchise after also arguably having a film that didn't go over very well in Episode 3. Or I'm sorry, not Episode 3, Jurassic Park 3. Although people didn't like Lost World either, so really it was just the first one that everybody really got behind. So, if you have the opportunity, if you haven't gone and listened to those secondary podcasts, I would encourage you to do so. Certainly provided me a lot of perspective, and again, made me feel a little bad that maybe my criticism over the prequels, even though I love the prequels, but over the prequel movie making process may not have been all that fair. I do think that the prequels didn't have the level of attention in as it relates to making sure, or fear, I should say. The prequels didn't have the level of fear attached to the new Star Wars movies in Disney, because now people are when the prequels came out, people didn't realize that the prequels could potentially not be good. Everybody just assumed they were going to be good, and the expectations were so high that I don't think they could have ever been met. And I suppose that the argument against that would be The Force Awakens, and that met everybody's expectations. But we kind of felt going into it that it was going to be great just because we knew J.J. Abrams was a good filmmaker, and they were not going to screw up the movie that launches them, that launches this franchise once again. All right, let's switch gears over to Rogue One, and we'll start off with some toys. These are just some leaked photographs of Lego toys, and we've got a tank. I think they called it a Landspeeder in the description. You saw this in the teaser trailer. You saw the stormtroopers riding it. We have an AT-ST, very similar to the Return of the Jedi AT-ST, the two-legged chicken walker. We see the TIE Striker, the two-winged TIE Striker that we saw in some of the leaked footage. Again, basically looks like a TIE Interceptor. The cockpit's a little bit more elongated, like a soda or beer can, and then it looks like each side has halves of the Interceptor wings. And I actually like this design quite a bit because it looks like a legitimate old precursor to the TIE Interceptor, meaning it only has half the wings, so it looks like, hey, we had this one that had pointy dagger wings on it, but it only had 2, let's give it 4, this kind of thing. We see the U-Wing, the Rebel U-Wing transport, the one that looks like kind of a hybrid between an X-Wing fighter, a little bit of the Millennium Falcon thrown in, and a Y-Wing, or maybe even an A-Wing. We also know that this ship is much more of a transport. The underbelly of the ship, from the top down, it looks like a standard sort of starfighter. But when you look at the bottom, you realize that it has a belly on it that essentially can carry troops. A really great looking ship, though. And then we have something that we hadn't seen at all yet, and that is a